Our controller code sanitizes the SKU it receives from the web address, which it then passes to the model code. Our model code, in turn, receives that as input from the controller code, and it's a good idea to sanitize the input there also. It might seem redundant to sanitize the input in both places, but you have to remember that model code might get called from multiple controllers. Whenever a piece of code receives input from somewhere else, whether that's directly from a site visitor or from code dealing with another concern, you want to filter or sanitize that input. In our model code, we'll use a new method of the PDO class to make sure our query is not subject to a SQL injection, the prepare method. Open shirts.php in your text editor and scroll down to the getProduct single function we're working on. Here's our query. Right now, it has a hard-coded 108 in the where clause. We essentially want to change the 108 to use the SKU variable instead, but in a way that is not vulnerable to a SQL injection. That's what PDO's prepare method can do for us. Instead of running the query at this point, let's call the prepare method. You pass the prepare method a query, and it prepares it to run without actually running it yet. Now, in place of the SKU value, we're going to put a placeholder. You can do this a couple of ways, and I encourage you to check out the prepare methods documentation. We're going to do it with a question mark, which is considered an unnamed placeholder. Our results variable is still a PDO statement object like it was before, but the statement hasn't been run yet, so there's no result set to fetch. Before we run it, we want our SKU value to be used where the placeholder is. We do that by calling a method on the results object. The method is called bindParam. This is short for bind parameter, and it can be used to connect a variable to one of the placeholders in the SQL statement. This method receives two arguments. The first is a reference to the placeholder. With unnamed placeholders, you specify the number of the placeholder like this. In our case, that's 1 because we want to bind to the first parameter. We only have one question mark, so there's actually only one we can bind to. The second argument is a reference to a variable that you want to bind to that placeholder. This line of code will replace the first question mark in our query with a value from the SKU variable in a way that protects it from a SQL injection. After we have our one parameter bound, we can run the query by calling the execute method. Our results object now has the result set inside of it just like it did when we ran the query method, and we can use the fetch method to retrieve it. Just to recap, this line here creates a PDO statement object with the SQL query we want to run. It contains a question mark instead of a SKU. This line here binds our SKU variable to that first question mark. This line here executes the query, which loads the result set into our results object. This line of code then calls the fetch method to retrieve the product information for the one product that matches the SKU and loads it into the product variable so it can be returned back to the controller. One thing to note about this fetch method: if there is no shirt that matches the SKU, then our results object will contain no records. If we call the fetch method in that case, it will return a Boolean false. This is exactly what we want. The product variable will contain an array of shirt details if a shirt is found, or it will contain a Boolean false. Let's add some troubleshooting code here so we can take a look at this return value in the browser. Let's refresh this page for shirt 108. As you can see, our function will return an array of shirt details corresponding to shirt number 108, the orange Mike the Frog shirt. If we change that to shirt 109, we'll get a different set of shirt details for the gray Get Coding shirt. Let's see what happens when we change this to 202, an invalid shirt ID. As you can see, the product variable is a Boolean false. Our code ran the query with the SKU of 202 and got no results back because no shirt in our database has that SKU. Then, when the fetch method was called on the result set, Instead of returning an array of shirt details, it returned a Boolean false. Let's remove this troubleshooting code now. Let's refresh the page for shirt 202. Since there is no shirt 202, the product variable is empty. When the product variable is empty, the controller code redirects to the shirt listing page. From here, we can click on shirt 101. We see the details there. We can also change the web address to something like shirt 131. And we'll see those details here. We have the shirt detail pages working again, at least for the data in the products table. The last thing we'll need to tackle is available sizes. We'll need to create another table to hold that information.